What we're dealing with right now in my industry is a lot of what we're calling imitation attacks, which are attacks that appear very, very human-like. Now, in the beginning, we didn't call them imitation attacks. We called them HTTP requests. When you requested an asset from your server, you would deliver it because you were a good citizen of the internet, and that's just the way things were built to work. And then over time, we started adding a lot of duct tape and Band-Aids to the internet. We started adding a lot of walls and hurdles in order to block the points in our systems that we recognized were being taken advantage of. Now, as we started to build those walls and hurdles, all we were doing is driving attackers to look more and more like legitimate traffic, because as long as we were a business whose responsibility it was to make money, we had to still keep our services open to normal people. So those walls ended up being really, really crappy. I bet you a lot of people here have probably dealt with IP rate limit whack-a-moles, where you're finding something, you're blocking it, you're finding it, you're blocking it, you're finding it, you're blocking it over and over and over again. Now, in order to persistently avoid continuous attacks from advanced attackers, you need to remove the incentives. Now, anyone who has children or pets knows this. It's relatively easy. If you have a dog that's jumping up the counter to get your food, you move the food. You remove the incentive for the annoying thing that's constantly bothering you, and then you end up being able to live a somewhat happier life. All incentives come down to a cost versus value equation. Now, for manual fraud and manual attacks, if I'm attacking you, and over the course of 2 hours, I can get $10,000 worth of value out of you, I'm gonna do that all day, every day, because I'm gonna live a very, very happy, beautiful life. But now if that value drops down to $1, I'm not necessarily going to go away, because there's still value there. I just need to figure out how to scale my operations 1,000, 10,000x in order to get the value that I was getting before out of the same sort of attack. Now, that level of scale is not necessarily trivially easy, but it's definitely doable as long as the cost is there. So the secret to defeating attackers, and this really is a talk that could be done in about 5 minutes if I could end here, is just increase the cost it takes for anyone to interact with your service and decrease the value anyone can get out of your service. Now, that sounds perfect. Unfortunately, for a lot of the businesses that we work at, this is directly the opposite of what we need to do to build a happy, thriving user base. So we are hamstringified at the start by being unable to do what we really need to do to secure our services, when then we end up in these discussions with executives and vice presidents about the gradient of security and where you want to be, where do you want these hurdles, what friction do you want to apply where in order to reduce this problem overall. And this is where a lot of the nuance comes in when defeating persistent attackers, because you need to craft mitigation responses specific to the traffic that you have coming in while minimizing the damage to real users as much as possible. We're going to jump into the economics of attacks. In order to properly do this, I want to go through an example of a type of attack that I see on a daily basis. So credential stuffing is probably on the tip of the tongue for a lot of people nowadays due to the mega breaches that have occurred over the course of the past several years. LinkedIn, Yahoo, Ashley Madison, billions upon billions of email addresses and passwords, usernames and passwords leaked over the course of the past several years. I think from our recording of this, in 2018, I think we're up to about 8 billion different records leaked over the course of the past 3 years alone. So the path from data breach to fraud all takes the same steps, even though that fraud and damage for any individual company probably looks a little bit different. Industry to industry, fraud looks different. Even within industries, that fraud and damage and exploitation has different flavors. So it's hard to necessarily recognize that there might be generic ways of dealing with this until you start stepping back through the path. A lot of fraud and damage comes from account takeovers. A lot of mass account takeovers comes from credential stuffing. All that comes from credential spills, which are the types of data that come out from credential data breaches. Now, it's important to recognize that there's a line here of what you can control and what you can't control. You will never be able to control some stupid startup in Silicon Valley doing awful things with their data and losing millions upon millions of email addresses and passwords. That's just what we have to deal with. But what you can control is the first time an attacker has to lay their finger on any one of your services. Now, the problem here is that a lot of this line is now our websites and APIs. which historically have been some of the most difficult to defend out of anything. And you have it controlled by these awful product and engineering teams who are just dying to squeeze out every bit of user experience they can in order to get more users into the system, which leaves very, very little room for security. Websites and APIs amount to just being skins on top of our databases with a very, very, very soft, they're very soft targets right now with massive, massive surface area. For anyone who deals with web development, browsers themselves release every 6 weeks with new features that can be exploited by attackers in ways that, even if you're trying to stay on top of things, surprise even the experts. So credential stuffing, for anyone who needs a recap, is the automated replay of credentials across hundreds or thousands of other sites to find out who is reusing these passwords so that you can take their accounts over. Now, there's 4 pretty easy steps to going through this. You get a credential spill, you go through and you automate the logins, then you defeat whatever existing defenses there are, and then you distribute globally. Now, getting credentials in the first place is a lot easier than a lot of people probably assume. You can start right now by Googling combo list, one word, and you can start down the path of getting your own combo list, which has all the usernames and passwords that you might want to use. Now, what you might find when you do Google this is that you're going to come across some. They might not be the freshest things in the world, but they still are email addresses and passwords, and you can get them for relatively cheap. Now, I do see a lot of people on their phones right now. If you do start diving into researching combo lists, I'd probably want to do it from a more protected environment, because when you're going to sites that are clearly tailored towards more of the criminal spectrum, you want to do that from within an environment that secures yourself so that you're not screwing up your primary surfing devices, your laptops or phones. So don't come blaming Jerrod Overson at the end of this talk when you find malware on your phone. Next up, you need to get a tool. And these tools come in a bunch of different shapes and sizes. If you're big enough as a company, you're probably lucky enough to have tools specific to your company, which is kind of a badge of honor. But for the more generic ones, you get a lot of extreme configurability. This is Sentry MBA, which is a relatively basic tool at its start, HTTP level, but it's very, very configurable, very, very pluggable, and integrates with a lot of different services, and has been a mainstay of a lot of attacker communities for the past decade almost. And there's things like FraudFox, which you can actually go to the website right now. It's a really nice looking website. These tools clearly get design companies to make compelling websites that make you want to purchase these things. But you can read it up there. It's a virtual machine-based solution to beat browser fingerprinting, which means that it's pretty scalable at the start. You get your virtual machine, you configure it as necessary, you set it up with the scripts that you need to do the attacks that you're looking to do, and then you deploy it to whatever virtualized cloud service you fancy, and then you move right on. The last one we're going to go through is anti-detect, browser anti-detect. I think it's on version 8 now, if not, maybe it's in beta or something along those lines. And I think it's also is deployable as a browser plugin to Firefox. The patterns for these tools all center around the randomization of traffic properties in order to obscure fingerprints. Because when you have a mass scale attack, what you want to do is attribute some parts of the attack over here and some parts of the attack over here to the same attacker campaign so that you can target the campaign as a whole. These aim to obscure the ability to definitively attribute an attack to a particular campaign. Next, you need to defeat whatever existing defenses there are. There are a bunch of different kinds. You've probably seen something like this. This is Google's reCAPTCHA. This is version 2. When it cannot give you that green check, maybe you're going through an incognito browser or a new device, or you're going through Tor browser or something like that, it'll fall back to helping Google's machine learning algorithms understand what a sign is, or a road is, or a car, and you pick those boxes in order to basically train this mega multi-billion-dollar company's software, which makes us all feel good. The first version relied on those squiggly letters, which also helped Google transcribe those hard-to-read texts. Version 3 is coming out, which is currently in beta, if I'm not mistaken. It'll undoubtedly be 1,000,000 times better than this one, which was 1,000,000 times better than the first one. But the problem with all these generic, commoditized solutions is that if you have a defense that everyone is using and doesn't really get configured much, is that it breeds a market for services that will bypass those defenses. This is death by CAPTCHA. which is one of dozens of CAPTCHA solver services out there. You can Google CAPTCHA solvers, get a whole list of pages of things that you can integrate with, and you can pick whichever one suits your fancy. This is actually a very good service. It has a bunch of libraries. It integrates with whatever languages you might be interested in using, Node, Ruby, Python, Java, whatever else. You can see up in the upper right or middle right-hand side, gives you an up-to-date status of how long it's taking to solve these CAPTCHAs. At the time of the screenshot, it was about 10 seconds. Now, a service like this, solving something like this, probably should be expensive, right? Death by CAPTCHA, for $1.39, you can get 1,000 solved CAPTCHAs. Not CAPTCHA attempts, solved CAPTCHAs. That's pretty good. I'm actually going through this, part of another talk. What powers these things is really interesting. You get a lot of advertisements online if you're browsing less than reputable sites, looking for people, stay-at-home, work-from-home moms, things like that. It's like, hey, do you want to make $10,000 a month staying at home? And all you have to do is transcribe books. And you get these people who use these services, and what they're actually doing is powering services like these. So you get people who are just typing, thinking they're doing something good for the world, and what they're doing is powering stuff like this. And services like that, of course, then end up training CAPTCHA solvers in order to more automatically defeat CAPTCHAs in the future. It's a really, really fantastic ecosystem that builds up around all these things. And then finally, you need to distribute globally. And this is largely due to one of those really, really poor hurdles that we set up about 20 years ago. Firewalls, WAFs, things like that. Basically, the IP rate limits. You can't anymore just send hundreds of thousands of requests from an IP address at your home without getting smacked by a rate limit. So now you just have to distribute globally. And before, getting a bunch of IP addresses might have been a bit of a pain, might have been something that you had to actually search a little bit. Now, thankfully, you can just go to DigitalOcean, Azure, Microsoft, Google, AWS, a bunch of services like that, and get tons of IP addresses distributed globally, which is beautiful. And if that's not good enough for you, then you also have billions upon billions of horribly insecure Internet of Things devices that are all located in our residences, which are inevitably going to be taken over at some point, because who would have thought that a wireless toothbrush would not have a lifespan of decades? Now, as soon as these things fall into their end-of-life phase, they're not going to get the security patches. They're not going to get the firmware updates, if you were updating the firmware in the first place, and they will inevitably be exploited. Your wireless routers, your wireless light bulbs, your wireless refrigerators, your cameras, all of these things. I have a bunch of that crap, and I can't even stay on top of all the security exploits that is affecting all of them. Now, for anyone just purchasing this stuff and hooking it up and not even thinking about updating it once in the first place, it enables these botnets to form on residential IP addresses, which are so much harder to manage because you have a much higher probability of affecting legitimate traffic. So now the cost of all this. You can get credential lists for $0. Now they're not going to be as fresh or as valid as something that was just breached, but they're still got usernames and passwords. To go through and use a tool, you can certainly configure it yourself if you find that is something you want to do. But since you're a criminal who's trying to get as much money as possible, you might as well just spend $50 and have somebody do it for you. Now, if you wanted to engage in a really decent-sized credential stuffing campaign, you're probably going to want about 100,000 account takeover attempts. Now, at Shape, we see anywhere between 0.2 and 2% success rate on credential stuffing attacks, depending on the freshness and validity of the credentials being used. Let's assume that we want to get about a 1% hit rate to get 1,000 accounts. So we're actually going to use 100x the base cost of death by CAPTCHA, so it'll be about $139. And then to distribute that globally, about 100 requests per IP address. We can space that out over a few days, about a couple dollars. So in order to get 1,000 accounts, it costs you less than $200 out of pocket. Now, that only really means something to you if you can attribute a particular value to those accounts. Now, for any of the businesses that you work at right now, you probably have someone in the company who can understand what the value of a particular account is. But in general, we see things as low as 50 cents to as high as $8.50 to $10. So on the low end, spend $200, you're getting about $500 back. On the high end, you spend $200, you're getting $10,000 back. it's a pretty decent return at the start. So with it being so cheap and with the value being so high, what the hell are you going to do to affect this? And this is a hard problem. Even as a company, when we started, we knew that there was a problem. We knew it needed to be solved. It took us years to figure out how we were going to be able to do this effectively. So one of the things that we had to learn very early on, which really in retrospect should have been more obvious given the way security on the internet has evolved, is that you need to separate as far as possible your ability to detect from your ability to mitigate. Now we go back to the IP rate limiting problem, which is antiquated, but is something that is easy for people to wrap their heads around. Now, if you have an attack coming in an IP address, you have a fantastic way at having visibility over the entire spectrum of that attack. As soon as you start blocking an IP address, you distribute and you filter that around, and it becomes harder for you to actually find all of that attack. So, I mean, that is obviously a very, very rudimentary example. And now as you get to more sophisticated adversaries, you need to make sure that you are doing a much better job at preserving your ability to detect, because as soon as you start blocking on it, you're incentivizing the attacker to find a way around that. And as soon as they get around your way to detect, then they've substantially damaged your ability to have visibility on the entire attack. So you need to have multiple ways of detecting. Now, I focus a lot on websites, but a lot of these concepts apply to a bunch of different layers. Certainly things like browser fingerprints, a lot of what ad tech has been using over the course of the past few decades, the same way that they can track you going to, I don't know, whatever site, purchasing boat parts, then you go some book selling site and they're selling you, I don't know, some book about boat car. This is the first time I used that metaphor, and that really fell apart quickly. But I think you probably all understand what I'm talking about. They use a lot of commodity type signals that can be gathered from browsers, like the list of fonts that you have, the list of plugins in your browser, screen dimensions, OS, user agent, things like that. They all can be put together to perform a relatively decent fingerprint of your traffic throughout the internet. As soon as you start blocking that, of course, then you get tools like the ones I showed you, which randomize all those properties. You can profile the hardware. Now, if somebody's telling you that they have an NVIDIA graphics card, you should be able to do NVIDIA graphicsy things on that card in order to verify whether or not they actually have what they say they're having. I mean, that is probing to see whether or not traffic is lying to you. Just profiling the hardware in general is a good way to see patterns in traffic. OS level stuff, if you have access to it. One thing that you can do, because you have internal knowledge in your company, is understand better the demographics and the patterns of your good traffic. Now, if you're regionally located, you should have a very good understanding as to what good regional traffic is, and as you start to spread further out of that region, you gain better ability at swatting down swaths of traffic that look strange because they don't match your regional demographics. Your diurnal patterns. When do people start using your website? When do people stop using your website? What browsers pop up during some of the parts of the day? What parts of the day do browsers die off at? Those things are really good ways at giving you insight into whether or not something's happening that you don't really, that you can't see otherwise. One thing that would be valuable, and this is increases depending on the team sophistication and the tool set that you've started to build around your defenses, is to start building in tamper evidence checks that alert you as to whether or not you've got a sophisticated attacker trying to get through multiple layers of your detection and security. Now, I'm not saying you block on these, but these are good warning signs that you need to have a team looking at this particular actor in order to figure out what they're doing so you can get ahead of them before they do substantial damage. So now blocking an attacker is not just finding out what they look like and blocking the particular tool and then moving on. You need to craft mitigation that is appropriate for the attacker at hand. Now, if you're dealing with relatively unsophisticated attackers, you can probably do a pretty good job at just blocking however that tool is working. If you don't have somebody who can develop their own tools or can craft their own configurations, then you can stop them for a decent amount of time just by targeting that. But as soon as you get to more sophisticated attackers who are developing their own tools or their own configurations or modifying open source tools, you need to figure out how to affect them in different ways. Now, it might be targeting their infrastructure. they're heavily invested in Azure services, then maybe just targeting Azure in general, so they have to migrate everything, might incur a specific cost that is particularly damaging to them. If they're even more sophisticated, you might have to go so far as to damage their reputation, either in the industry or on the dark web or something along those lines. And this is where you have to get a team that is well-versed in a lot of how these things work in order to figure out the mitigation that is going to do the most damage. So attacking the more sophisticated adversaries, you're going to have to be aware of their software development lifecycle, which is kind of easy for us to do because it's the same software development lifecycle that everyone goes through when they're developing software. You go through a requirements gathering and planning phase. Now, for an attacker, put on your attacker hat. Think back to the days where you were writing scripts or happily coding away without worrying about the depths of horrible security problems everywhere. What do you do when you figure out how to write software? You figure out what you're going to need to work on, what URLs are going to work, what tools do you need to invest in, what data do you need to ingest in order to power your systems. Then you go through a development phase, which is very similar to any development phase. You're coding. But I want you to also think about the tool set that you might invest in. I'm going to refer to that in a few slides because this is where a lot of work and a lot of cost is being incurred. You go through testing, making sure that you've addressed all the edge cases that might pop up with the website, making sure that if you're using services, that you've accounted for their downtime. If you have an automated attack that is going on for days, weeks, or months at a time, you don't want to be babysitting it. You want it to be taking care of itself. This is the phase where you're actually making sure all that works. Now, the integration phase is the last real phase of the development process for an attacker. You're going through making sure everything works, integrates with botnets, the proxies you're using, whatever else. The next phase is where value is generated. In the attacker's world, release is the execution of the attack. Now, this is important because these first 4 stages are where cost is incurred. The 5th stage is where value is realized. Now, if you're dealing with a sophisticated attacker, you want to prolong those cost-incurring stages to as long as possible and reduce the value generation phase to as short a time as possible. Now, this is different per attacker. Now, let's go back to the development phase. Let's say, for example, there's an attack on a website that is using something like Selenium, which is a browser automation software. Now, you might have 8,000 different ways of detecting and blocking Selenium, but if you deploy all those at once, what you've done is tell the attacker in the planning phase, I shouldn't bother with Selenium. I can move on to this other thing because I know Selenium doesn't work. You've sped them up. You've saved them money. That's not effective. What you want to do is to not block on just about anything you can until they're in the value generation phase, and then you turn on the minimum aspect of your defenses that mitigates them for the time being and resets their software development lifecycle. So they go through the release generation phase, or they go through a release, they attack, you turn on their defenses, you reset them, you go through it again, you reset them over and over again. If you can have them invest months of time into Selenium when you've reliably blocked them at every turn, you have done a fantastic job at really pissing off attackers. And that's really what this comes down to, is that you want to piss people off as much as possible so that they stop attacking you. All right, so I'm going to go into a couple of case studies. Going through this as a company, Shape is a very, very secretive company. I've had to go through and make things pretty high level and abstract. Let's hope the message comes across. I'm going to be ending a little bit early. Please get questions ready if you want to go into anything more deeply. So first one I'm going to go through is the one that was a little bit more difficult probably to kind of hand wave over during the initial phase, is a case where we actively had to damage the reputation of an actor that was bothering one of our larger bank customers. So the scenario here is that this is a scraper that was finding ways to scrape account details from a big US bank. Well funded too, which means that they're also not going to go away as easily as an independent actor because they're getting money and their livelihood and their mortgages, their families, food on the table is not dependent on these attacks on a day-by-day basis. So we saw the attackers cycle through a bunch of different properties on this bank, and that's the pattern that we see with a lot of customers where we protect all the surface area, is that they'll target generally the web at the start because web is just a horribly inhospitable place for security and development in general, and it's the softest target by far. And then as defenses start to pick up, they move on to Android, because Android is a rich ecosystem for development and a lot of developer-friendly tools. And then they'll go to iOS, which is usually the hardest to penetrate. But in this particular case, the version lag for our SDK was getting up there, and the defenses that we had available were somewhat behind the other two systems. So the attacker stayed on iOS and had a masterful control over the system in order to bypass a lot of the things that we were doing. And we went through this really annoying process where we would detect them, we would block them, they would bypass us and move on, and then we would detect, block, they bypass, detect, block, bypass over and over and over again over the course of multiple weeks. And this was both fun and annoying for us. I mean, it's fun when we find those actors who are especially skilled at getting past the myriad steps that we have that block everyone else, but it was also pissing us off because it was taking a lot of our time dealing with this guy. So what we found is that their bypass, their retooling effort was following a pretty regular schedule. We found that when we were mitigating later on in the day, those defenses would last longer, and then as soon as the morning time in this region popped around, we saw retooling activity regain speed, and they would be matching us one-to-one, sometimes retooling in minutes. So with a bunch of other analysis, when we found that the guy was working with a regular schedule, we also knew that every time there was success and they had enough success to know that it would stick around for a little bit of time, downstream consumers for this scraper were notified, and then every interruption ended up disrupting the downstream consumers where the reputation needed to be high in order for this scraper to maintain proper status. And then for when those disruptions were the longest, the distress was obviously the highest, and we could see this. So the technique we chose was to certainly start to target our primary defenses out of the working schedule. Now, think about all of you as you work. Now, if you start to have to pick up your responsibilities outside of your working schedule, that already starts to piss you off. And this is really where a lot of the benefit that we have as a company is that we're a lot of developers and we've done a lot of reverse engineering. We know a lot of these things. We just do what would piss us off. And we would certainly turn on the best defenses when the most eyeballs were on the actor's success. So we would track this. We would track when traffic would pick up after the success had been declared. And then as soon as the traffic was at a reasonable point, we would turn on our defenses in order to make sure that the most number of people saw this failure at the same time. And one of the more effective techniques is that we removed our defenses when we knew the actor was retooling. So with our tamper evidence checks and our ability to detect, because we weren't necessarily incentivizing the attacker to get around that detection mechanism, we had great visibility on when they were retooling, and we would just step back and put on our secondary defenses and then alternate those during the retooling process so the actor was not able to actually get to a working outcome without having the technique that they were pursuing be invalidated because we removed our defenses and put something else in place. Now, as developers, if there are any developers here, variable feedback and this infuriating process is so disruptive to motivation and progress. And over the course of a few weeks of this back and forth, we ended up declaring success and haven't seen problems from that attacker ever since. Next case study is based around a credential stuffer who was actively engaging in account takeovers on a big US retailer. This was, I think, mostly on web. This was relatively early on, about a couple years ago at this point. So we were still learning a lot of the things that we needed to do as we started to see the evolution in attacker sophistication. Because it was so early and because we had not fully understood how to message this strategy with customers, we ended up overusing some of our techniques in order to provide immediate results, but damaging the long-term game. So we were mitigating on a lot of what we were using to detect because we figured we had so much, we were good. And then as we started to get deeper and deeper, we got to the point where we really didn't feel comfortable mitigating on anything we had left, because if we lost that, we'd lose all visibility on this actor. So that encouraged us to build a new feature that enabled us to deliver custom payloads to that particular actor. So now this is certainly something that required a bit of development, a bit of testing, a bit of planning. The way that we were attacking this as a company was by building the as much flexibility as possible at the layers where we knew we would need to iterate on. So in this case, a lot of our system works with JavaScript and with a reverse proxy to make the decisions as traffic comes back through. We ended up making the proxy infinitely scriptable so that we could essentially build new features on the fly as we needed it. And then our JavaScript is highly protected. We could inject stuff as we needed. The combination of these two features gave us the ability to craft specific responses for specific traffics that we were detecting and deliver JavaScript specific to those attackers, those actors. So in this case, we delivered code that would inspect and interrogate the browser APIs that we knew the actor was hooking into, and then it would deliver that code back up to us. So what we were doing is seeing literally how the attacker was modifying their source code in the browser in real time. Now that, as somebody who likes this field and likes the reverse engineering aspect and the security aspect, it's like we have bad people coming in who are trying to damage ourselves, our families, our siblings, our parents, our children, and they're running our code. Like, that is outrageous. I'm sure they didn't really recognize the extent of what we could do, but it's like a criminal walking in here and just handing out USB drives. Like, you're not just going to stick those in because that's outrageous. This is essentially that in reverse. They're requesting code from us, and we're delivering it to them, doing something they probably don't expect we're doing because they can't see what we're doing. So this code, we found out we were able to concretely link that to an open source repository in GitHub, because there was a commented out console log line in that code that had a typo in it. And that typo made it very easy to Google and search on GitHub. We found this open source plugin that was used in this attack suite that we actually had already accounted for, but this was a developer who was modifying lots of things, and we were able to be a lot more comfortable in our mitigation techniques because we knew that this particular attacker was just largely lucky. Like, we thought that this guy was a genius. We thought he had reverse engineered a lot of things that he needed to in order to bypass us. But what we found is that he was just mostly going through trial and error and trying to get around areas that we had a lot of defenses. And we leveraged this because now we knew the extent of what he was capable of and could manipulate JavaScript on the fly with this new feature. So the defenses that we crafted here, we built up defenses based on the tool that we knew he was using. So we made sure that we had a trove as necessary in order to make sure that we were able to mitigate on stuff that we weren't necessarily using to detect. But we are also able to now provide variable feedback during the actual retooling phase. So for anyone who's dealt with web development, which is basically just trial and error until something works and then you walk away. Now, as you're dealing with variable feedback, this particular attacker might have something that does work if he has 4 console log statements in one of his functions, but doesn't work if he has 3. Now, that level of manipulation and being able to witness this stuff on the server side and figuring out what is pissing him off the most, that is fascinating, because then you start to see when they kind of spiral out into directions that are not going to be fruitful, and then you can keep on pushing them there. And then eventually they go away because it's not valuable enough to continue these attacks, and they move on to softer targets. So recap. If you take one thing away from this, detection and mitigation are completely separate things, and you need to preserve your ability to detect at all costs. Mitigation can be done any bunch of different ways on a variety of layers. Detection is sacred. Maintain it. Protect the data that you're using to detect. Now, in the web world, where a lot of I work, Protecting JavaScript and data sent out of a browser is extremely difficult. Whatever you can do to obscure what you're looking at, to maybe over-collect and under-collect, so it's not obvious necessarily what you're specifically looking at, and then obscuring what's going back along with a bunch of tamper evidence checks, gives you the ability to be a little bit more comfortable with what you are doing. Guess I'm just about out of time. So understand what is incentivizing your attackers. Make sure that you have a cost versus value equation, that you are banging off other people so that you can have people poke holes through your assumptions and your hypotheses. And work with product to build app level defenses. I know from the security side, there was nothing that I hated more than working with product and engineering teams, because they didn't care about anything I was talking about. They would make sure that they weren't susceptible to cross-site scripting, and maybe they would over-escape to protect against SQL injection. But really, we need a lot more flexibility at the application level in order to craft defenses that are appropriate for the actor at hand, and not just assume that we can deploy mass defenses and they'll last for any amount of time. So to leave you with one thing, this is a quote that I found especially effective in some of our discussions in culture at Shape. So tactics is what you can do now when there's something to do. Strategy is what you can do when there's nothing to do. And in the security realm, we have a lot of strategy. We've got a lot of penetration testing, a lot of vulnerability testing, a lot of patching, a lot of reading of RSS feeds, a lot of dependency auditing. A lot of it is preparing for what if somebody attacks us over here. We don't have a big arsenal for what we can do when we're under attack. There are many teams who just who don't even have an answer to the question, how do you know if you're under attack? Let alone, what are you going to do if you do actually find yourself under attack? This is where we need to build up a lot of our resources, because this attacker sophistication trajectory is getting to a point where it's going to be worse in ways that we have no defenses for. And we are already well behind over the course of the past couple of years, and it's going to get much, much worse in the next 2 to 5. Thank you very much. I think this was going to 12:05, so we might have some time. Anyone in the back want to waive affirmation or rejection? All right, yellow shirt says it's all right.